So in this class, we talk a lot about several different methods for how you actually cost something. So you can make choices as a manager, right? Because there's no gap, there's no one telling you what to do. So whoever the top level manager is says, this is how I want you to report these things, or figure out a way to report these things, and you go do it. So this is one method for doing that. It works in very specific situations, so we're going to talk about that. So we're going to talk a little bit about job cost sheets, but I've removed a lot of this. So if you get into the Learn Smart and you're reading through the topics, there are more topics in this. This is the extent of what I'm testing over. So we're going to talk about things in context that you understand what's going on, but the actual stuff that is on these slides is all I'm going to ask you about. Okay, so chapter 16, which we do not do in this class, is called process costing. The reason why I tell you that is because the difference between job order costing is based on what process costing is. So process costing is making bulk stuff. So companies that produce mass amounts of the same identical thing follow process costing. I know exactly how much plastic goes in. I know exactly how much, like, let me think of an example. People who make expo markers, right? So process costing for the black expo marker, fairly straightforward, right? They know exactly the amount of ink that goes in, they know the sizing structure, they know the plastic, they know the branding. Nothing changes in the machine setup. They just hit a button and say go, and somebody stands at the end and says, oh yeah, they look good, right? The only variation would be is if the machine malfunctions. Job order costing is for things that are a little bit more unique in production makeup, right? So if I look at job order companies, they're going to do more custom type orders. They're going to have a more diverse product set, and then they're going to be really flexible with what they make. So the factory that makes the expo markers, that machine's not super flexible, right? Like the ink color might change, but the machine's not going to make something different. It's always going to make an expo marker. I'm talking about machines that you could set up differently to make completely different things. So people who make custom t-shirts. Is my cricket in here? Yeah, I'm always going to use that as an example. It's great. Why? Because it's like you're not buying stuff in bulk, so it's easy to think about. How many different types of t-shirts can you make? Literally anything you want, right? That's the idea of job order costing. I'm not limited in anything. I can make whatever you ask me for. So, here's the difference. If I look at direct materials, direct labor, and overhead costs on the left side, those are my product costs, right? So, any type of costing structure is going to use the same product costs. They're always going to have direct materials, they're always going to have direct labor, and they're always going to have overhead costs. If you look, though, you have a different level of customization for each job, right? So B17 might be completely different than B16 for what's actually allowed. So the way that they describe this in this book is types of cars. So trim levels, if you will. So you know you can go to like a Ford dealership and you could buy a Fusion, but then there are so many price levels for different Fusions. What makes the prices different? Sure.
Customization.
Yeah, so you could customize it. What else makes it different?
Trim package. Like the acct.
Okay, so what is a trim package? Because you're right, but what is it?
It's like the radio boost.
It's like the features in it, right? So if you go to a regular kind of run-of-the-mill car dealer, Ford, Honda, Toyota, whatever, and you don't actually specially order anything, we would still call it a specific level of customization because you're going to pick what you want, right? So they're going to show you their highest model of that car. So like, who in here knows the order of Ford truck models? I never know, that's why I ask. Yeah, what are they?
XL, XLT, Lariat, King Ranch, Limited, Platinum.
Okay, so how many was that? 7?
Something like that.
Okay, so let's say there are 7 of them. Every time he goes up a level, right, between what you say the first one was?
XL.
XL and Platinum. Every time he goes up a level, he gets something extra, right? So he either gets interior function, or he gets engine function, or he gets change in the body structure, the chassis, right? He gets something extra. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about customization. So we're not necessarily saying you go in and order something completely your own, because you could. That would cover this. So if you called Mercedes and you said, I want a completely custom vehicle, they'd do that for you. and they order it and it take you probably a year and a half to get it, right? But you can pretty much get everything you want as you walk up trim levels, because then you can ask for additional add-ons. So like, have you ever been in a car dealership in Texas and they've asked you if you wanted window tinting? That infuriates me. I think mostly because I'm not from Texas, but I'm like, we're on the surface of the sun and you don't want to tint my windows. Like, that's an add-on. Doesn't make no. Why don't you do it? What? I'm tired. Why? Are you a Chiefs fan? Should we talk about how funny that was? Should we? Yes. We enjoyed it. Any Chiefs fans in here? Like real Chiefs fans? Who are not afraid to say it after that stunning performance? You guys are no fun. Does it make sense? The cars? So the customization allows Ford in the same factory to add different things to roughly the same car, right? So there's no change in the actual, like the bed might be a little longer in the truck, you might get a crew cab instead of a quad cab, right? But the changes are minuscule as far as the machine. But the user experience of that truck is very different, right? That's what we're talking about. So here's how the costs flow. You have your raw materials inventory, you have your work in process inventory, your finished goods, and your cost of goods sold. Does that look familiar to you? Hopefully it does, it should. We talked about it. So, what we talked about last time with how to classify costs, or I should say the time before that, because we did the worksheet last time. What we talked about in terms of classifying costs is going to be the same across job costing systems. So just because we're doing unique style costing with job order costing does not mean that you don't have the same categories. So when Ford buys their stuff for whatever they're going to do, right, they buy their raw materials inventory. So all the stuff before they assemble it to make the truck. Anything that they've started production on but haven't finished is going to sit in their work in process inventory. Once they've finished it, it's going to move to their finished goods inventory. But everything in 1 through 3 is still on the balance sheet. So I'm going to tell the user, I have this stuff. I'm going to tell them where it is, like what part of the process it is. And then finally in number 4, it's going to move off the balance sheet onto the income statement. That line at the bottom about subsidiary records. So if you're thinking about Ford in particular, they have multiple manufacturing plants. Each manufacturing plant is going to keep its own record of these asset classes instead of Ford keeping one giant record of every manufacturing plant's working process. So, probably the biggest part that we talked about today, that we're going to talk about today because it's going to last forever for the rest of this class, is called an overhead rate. So, anyone know how overhead works? Anyone dealt with a business where you had to calculate overhead?
So we like add up your rent and all your overhead?
Okay, yeah. So depending on like what you do as a business, it might be as simple as saying like, okay, I pay $1,500 in rent for the month. I pay roughly $400 in utilities, so on and so forth, right? All those things that have to happen for the product to be made but aren't labor or materials. Okay, so overhead though, for the purposes of this class, is a budgeted item, which means that I need to be able to allocate it before it happens, which means that I have to have a way to do that. So up here, you're looking at the first iteration of what's called a predetermined overhead rate. So if I'm trying to figure out how effectively I can produce something, how costly it will be, I know what a labor hour costs me, right? I know I can go out and get a person for, let's say, for easy numbers, $10 an hour, right? I know exactly what it's going to cost me per hour. I don't know necessarily how efficient they're going to be. So there's always a little bit of room in there. I absolutely know what it's going to cost me in materials, right? And I can control those things. When I get to overhead, though, it's kind of like, well, what if my utilities go up every period? instead of waiting until I get the bill, I can estimate them. So here's how I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna calculate a predetermined overhead rate. There are several types of predetermined overhead rates, but this is the general formula for them. I promise this is going to matter to you. So my predetermined overhead rate is me saying, okay, based on how much I estimate in total overhead costs and my estimated activity base that I want to base this off of, here is what I think it's going to cost me per direct labor hour or per direct material or per direct whatever. The reason why I say it like that is I can pick anything as my activity base. So I'm going to say total estimated overhead. Estimated also means budgeted, synonyms, right? And then I'm going to say divided by my total activity base. Actually, I'm going to say estimated activity base. So let me give you an example. You've been in a Dillard's or Macy's. Which one do we like better?
Dillard's.
Dillard's. You seem very sure about that. Now Macy's man? You're like the star. What about the parade they put on?
It's okay.
Tough crowd. Okay, so you've been in a Dillard's. So how do you think when a person comes in to clean Dillard's, so let's say they have 3 floors, 3 different cleaning people come in every night. How do they pay that person? Let's just pick a floor. Let's say bottom floor, basement level floor. How do they pay the person who cleans the bottom floor? Do you have any idea, or do you just not want to talk to me?
I don't know. By square footage.
Okay, so by the hour, probably, right? By square footage. So they're gonna pick something that's easy to allocate, right? So who actually is paying Dillard's to be cleaned? Don't think too hard about it. Dillard's, right? But how do they determine what department pays what? So does it make sense for the fragrance counter that takes up maybe a 15th of the middle floor to pay for half the cost of cleaning? Not really, right? So it should be based on size, right, in theory. So if the shoe department takes up most of the space, then the shoe department should pay most of the cost, right? Have you ever gone out to dinner with your friends and you collectively ordered something and then you tried to split the bill, but you didn't actually order things that were equivalent in price? How do you pick who pays for what? Do you just split the bill? What do you do? Okay, so who wants to do this with me? So Walker, Angie, and I go to dinner. I'm not paying, by the way. I appreciate your raise. So Angie buys a $25 meal. Walker buys a $62 meal.
Cool.
And I buy a $9 drink.
You're splitting that tab.
What's the bill? Oh, you all do this in your head. 96 bucks? Like that? Okay. What's a third of 96?
32.
Should I pay 32 bucks?
No.
So how do I do it?
Copy paste.
Let's say I didn't see the itemized thing, right? How would I know what I should do with this?
You choose your item.
Do what?
So the $9 on the table will be.
Right,
Okay.
okay. Second option, so that I can go back to that restaurant at some point. What if I'm in a really tough spot and I like work with them, or like they're my boss? What do I do then? Don't go to dinner. That's a life lesson. But what do I do? Seriously, how do you split the bill?
That's the waitress.
You probably say, can we have bills? That's why they ask you, is this together or separate, right? because we're trying to make it easy for you, so you don't have to look at it and say, well, half of the total is this. That's what businesses do too. So if the shoe department makes up the entirety of the third floor, then the shoe department should pay the entirety of the cleaning costs for the third floor, right? Does the shoe department agree with that? Maybe, right? So you have to have some sort of predetermined rate. You have to have a policy. So I could do it based on square feet. So I could say, okay, if the entire cleaning cost for the store is $1,000, and we are total square feet for the store is 5,000 bucks. Let's say shoes are 2,000 square feet. Clothes, I know this is not how it's broken up, but we're gonna do it like this. 5,000 square feet, and we're gonna do 10 for easy numbers. And then other. Okay, so my predetermined overhead rate would be my total estimated overhead of $1,000 to clean it, right? My 10,000 square feet in total, my total estimated activity base, that's what I picked. I get this rate right here, which is my predetermined overhead rate. Then to figure out how much my shoe department spends, I take my 2,000 square feet of activity base times my predetermined overhead rate. And that gives me my overhead cost to allocate. Does that make sense? So a predetermined overhead rate, that's the general formula. We are gonna learn how to calculate all types of predetermined overhead rates, but if you understand the idea of I'm just trying to break the cost up across an activity base so that I know how to allocate it, that's it. That's probably the biggest piece of this chapter. So if you get that, smooth sailing. Anybody confused? I could do it based off anything. I could say the shoe department makes the most revenue. I could base it off revenue.
Now, is this assuming that each department's essentially its own independent entity here, not just everybody collectively working together to kind of pool all their money together?
Each department, as we move forward, is going to become more and more secular.
Okay.
Because they're trying to measure their own performance, not their performance within the store.
Okay.
Yes, good question. Okay, so when you set your predetermined overhead rate, this is what it looks like. Same thing we just did, estimated overhead cost divided by my estimated activity base. I put total in the formula so that you don't forget to add these three things. Right, so you're not just dividing it by the one that you're looking for. So like if I were looking for how much to allocate to shoes, I wouldn't just divide by the 2,000. I would divide by the total of all the things incorporated and then multiply it out to the portion that I'm trying to allocate. So that's why I stick total in here. It's not in the standard formula, but you do what you want. And then again, I can base it off anything. So this one particularly right here is 160%. So it means that my overhead cost, dollar for dollar, is 160% of each dollar I spend on direct labor cost. So in other words, if I spend $1 on direct labor cost, I spend $1.60 on overhead. Do you want your overhead rate to be higher or lower? It's kind of a trick question. So in terms of cost, you absolutely want your costs to be as low as they can be, right? In this class right now, you just want your overhead cost to be accurate. So if you find a way to calculate where your overhead cost is really low, but it's not accurate, you kind of screw yourself, right? Because you budget based on a number that doesn't help you. And then you look like you underperformed. If the same is true, if you guess, right? You overestimate what your overhead is, you look like you performed well for like a little bit of time. So you just want it to be accurate. Okay, so that's just a depiction of the jobs that we talked about with the truck. So if I did have, in fact, a 1.6 predetermined overhead rate, yeah.
Sorry, can you go back to the other slide? Thank you.
Huh? So I'm gonna keep talking through the next one. If you did in fact have 160% overhead rate, then you would just apply it across all the departments where it was relevant. So that's what you're seeing on that. So each job had that rate applied to its direct labor to determine its overhead. So the way this works on a test is that I give you a bunch of numbers, and I could give you the rate, or I could say calculate the rate. So if you can calculate the rate, that's great. If you can't, that's not good. But calculate the rate. And then you need to know how to apply the rate. Right, so if I base this rate right here off direct labor costs, then I'm then gonna look at each job, say what were the direct labor costs, and multiply by that. It's literally as simple as multiplying by the same thing. Here's the real kicker that people get stuck with. And it makes sense when I say it, but it will confuse you on a test and people get stuck the first time. You have to multiply that 1.6, whatever you determine your predetermined overhead rate to be, you have to multiply it to be able to allocate it. You have to multiply it by the same measure that you divided it here. So if you divide by estimated activity base, here in this case was direct labor, you can't then multiply the 1.6 times direct materials. It doesn't work. Whatever you used in the denominator has to be what you use to allocate it out. If you don't, your math will be very wildly wrong. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to do, yeah. Whatever I use in the denominator, so in this case, it's just the generalized formula total, right? But when I did the math here, this number right here is total direct labor hours, or total direct labor cost. Whatever I use in the denominator here is the number that I have to use to allocate that rate across. Does that make sense? So prior to this period beginning, I said, okay, I'm gonna have $125,000, I estimate, in direct labor cost. So I'm gonna take my total estimated overhead divided by my total estimated labor cost, and I get 160%. To be able to allocate that, then I have to take that 160% and multiply it by the same measure that was here. So not the total, but the amount per job. So that job was $1,000 in direct labor cost. So for every dollar I spent there, I spent $1.60 on overhead. So when I multiply them together, I end up with 1,000 in direct labor, but 1,600 of overhead just for that job. Does that make sense? Sort of. So when I did it right here, I had total square feet, right? So I took my total estimated costs divided by my total square feet, my activity base, and I got, what's this rate? 0.1, right? Times 100 is 10%. So my overhead rate, 10 cents on every dollar I spend. Does that make sense? Okay, so when I allocated it, I took the square footage of just the department I wanted to know about, because that was the same measure I used here, square feet and square feet. I took the shoe department square feet and I multiplied it by my 10% overhead rate, and I got my allocated overhead just for shoes. Does that help? So whatever you put in the denominator has to be the same thing you multiply out. You can't cross it. So it can't be direct labor, direct materials, or direct labor, square footage, direct labor revenue. It's gotta match. Whatever you put here, in terms of what it is, what it represents, has to be here too. No. So the problem is going to tell you what you use for the predetermined overhead rate. So they'll tell you company XYZ determines its overhead based on direct labor hours. So there's just one rate. When we get into different costing structures, you will calculate one for each type of overhead that you do. But yes, it's a one-to-one relationship. Yeah. Is there a question over here I missed? Yeah. I'm not going to ask you to do the T accounts for this. I'm only showing you this in terms of like it moves from the balance sheet to the income statement. So these three right here, first three, all on the balance sheet, like it says, right? You did a problem. That last problem, number 10, on that sheet that you had, this is why it works. This is why you can calculate total manufacturing costs, and then you can calculate cost of goods manufactured. And it's why you have to separate out work in process and ending inventory, because they move through asset accounts into an expense account. So if you were really good at 2301 and these make sense to you, then more power to you, great, do them. I'm not gonna make you do this on a test. Because I'm not going to make you do the journal entries. I just want to know if you can calculate it, if you know what it means. Sound like a plan? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've been drawing these sort of as we've been talking about them, but I figured I should probably show you a simple one, right? So we've been talking about, okay, so you've got raw materials, you've got direct labor, you've got overhead. What's your balance sheet look like? And I sort of draw some makeshift thing over here. Here's what it actually looks like. the inventory section of your balance sheet, obviously this is an incomplete balance sheet, it's just showing you inventory. But the inventory section of your balance sheet in your current asset section is gonna show you every part of the inventory process. So it's gonna say, I've got $1,400 in raw materials inventory, meaning I bought it, I have it, but I haven't done anything with it yet. My work in progress inventory tells me that 3420 of that I've started to produce, like I've started to manufacture it into something that matters to me, but I haven't finished it. And then I've got 6,000 of things that I have finished, but I have not sold. Does that make sense? So, my total inventory as an asset is 10,820, but the managers and the officers and whomever wants to know what portion's actually ready to go versus what portion are you still working on. That's why they're separate. Once you sell them, they end up in that second line on the income statement. I never use the laser. I should. So fun. Actually, I use it on people outside. I just never use it in class. I like to just like hold it like a good shot. It's like, okay. Okay, so once I move it from finished goods, the portion that I sell ends up here in cost of goods sold. Everybody okay with that? So if I ask the question on a test and I give you these categories and I have you add them up and then I ask you, what statement do they go on? You're okay with which go on the balance sheet, which goes on the income statement? Because I always ask that question. I want to know. Because in real life, that's something that drives me freaking crazy. Like when people who do accounting in real life give me a balance sheet that's got an income statement idea on it. Like you sold something and so you got it in some sort of subcategory over here, drives me freaking crazy. So I always ask the question because I'm like, trying to make the world a better place and whatnot. Okay, one last thing we have to talk about. When you apply overhead, which is what we were doing right here, so apply and allocate mean the same thing. We're okay with what those words mean? Apply and allocate. Okay, when you do that, it's based on a budgetary number, a guess. Right, so like 90% of accounting is estimates because I'm getting the numbers after the fact and then I'm trying to project for something that hasn't happened yet. So I'm guessing, and I'm doing my best to guess as accurately as possible, but I am guessing. So when I do that, I have the ability to over allocate or under allocate. In this case, it's called over apply or under apply. And what that means is if I budget for something and I apply $1,600 of overhead to the project, and then I look back at the end of the month and I've only spent $1,400. I was over applied by 200. Does that make sense? Okay, here's why that matters. That is the actual rule. Several of you really like rules, so I gave you the rule. All you have to think about in terms of this is when I over applied it, did I end up spending more or less than I wanted to? Okay, so think about it for a second. So applied is an estimated number, actual is what I really spent. Okay, so in an event where what I actually spent is greater than what I applied, I was under applied. That's pretty straightforward, right? If what I applied was less than I was under applied. What does that mean though? And that's why I put this up here. If I under applied it, that means I didn't apply enough cost to it, which means my job is under costed and my cost of goods sold is too low. And to fix it, I would have to debit cost of goods sold and credit factory overhead. Again, not gonna ask you for this piece, but I would likely say, here was my actual amount, here was my applied amount. Was I over applied or under applied? And then I'd say, how does that impact your cost of goods sold? So you do have to understand the relationship, even if I don't ask you for the journal entry. So does the relationship make sense? Not at all? Some of it. Okay. I'm gonna take that as a 50% shot and we'll try it on Wednesday. Sound like a plan? Okay. That is all I have for the comp center 15. I'll bring you something for 15. I may put it up here. I may not bring it in paper just because there are so many of you.
God damn, they moved through that so fast.
Move it back.
Yeah, for real. We're just going fast. I'm like, I can't write like that. Oh,
So, no, you're welcome to write them, but like, don't pay them.
okay.
They're where you can get them.
Thank you.
You can send it to.
Yeah.
I'll move back and forth for a large part.
Okay.
I don't want anyone to leave it too. You don't have to. All right. So, yeah, I give you some feedback. Left some face out.
Yeah, honestly. I like it.
It's not bad, right?
No.
So I can't tell if it's just general board. It's not just for your board. I love God. Like, just give me 3 times next week and it's done. But sometimes it's lost. So I just have to ask.
I'm kind of lost. But I'm just writing everything down so fast that I'm not having time to comprehend anything.
It might be easier if you like look at the notes first and read them last.
Yeah.
Give it a slide.
This one's more critical.
This is easier than financial, though. I
Yes.
think. Or it makes more sense.
Macro.
For the writing thing, for what it's worth, if writing distracts you from the actual like interaction, just don't write it down. I always post
Yeah,
to write down our thoughts.
that's true.
Or I'll just be better about posting. Oh, me too.
Okay.
So, number 6, when we talked about you wanted us to set we're all broke.
So it depends on what you want. You want to do that and you can explain it like that. Normally what happens is you actually need to say A2 and just get the total.
Okay, so normally this is one.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just saying the average growth between years 1 and 3, which is not the same as the actual growth.
Okay. Yeah, so just calculate the trend percentage for the other two. So it'd be like a 1, 2,
Yeah,
2,
exactly, yeah. And then you could say overall from 1 to 3, here's what it is. And then when you divide it by 2, that's another measure. It's like the average growth between 1 and 3. It depends on what you want.
Say I started my company year before COVID, and I had the whole COVID mess for years, but now I'm back profitable and I'm operating. Trash, now we're at I don't know.
So it depends on what you want. So if you want them to give you money, usually the better option is to show them the actual start fund, but to give them the itemized start fund. So if you average your COVID year, you generally undersell your other years. So you cover the fact that it was a loss, but you undersell how well it was in years where it wasn't a loss. So a lot of times what people do is they literally do a pre and post whatever dramatic. So